I knew my husband had broken something inside our marriage. The moment I saw the woman sitting at my dining room table, she held one of my cream-colored linen napkins neatly across her lap, while candlelight flickered against the wine glasses between us. Thanksgiving jazz played softly from the kitchen speaker. Daniel insisted on using every year, and the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon apples still floated warmly through the house. For one strange second, my mind refused to recognize her. Then she smiled at me, and suddenly I was 12 years old again, standing barefoot on a freezing porch while she locked the front door behind me because I had forgotten to fold laundry the right way. My chest tightened so fast I could barely breathe. Daniel stepped out of the kitchen carrying a bottle of red wine, his face bright with nervous excitement. "There you are," he said softly. "I wanted tonight to be special." Special. God, I had never seen a man misunderstand his wife's pain so completely, because the woman sitting at my table wasn't family. She was the reason I had spent half my life learning how to survive without one. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Judith Mercer sat perfectly still beneath the warm dining room lights, dressed in a soft gray sweater that made her look harmless. Older, smaller than I remembered. Age had gentled the sharp edges of her face, but not enough to erase what lived underneath it. "Eleanor," she said carefully, as though speaking too loudly might scare me away. "You look beautiful." My hands immediately started trembling, not dramatically, just enough that I curled them into fists before Daniel could notice. Or maybe he did notice. Maybe he just misunderstood what he was seeing. Daniel set the wine bottle down and crossed the room slowly, like someone approaching a wounded animal. "I know this is a surprise," he said, "but I thought maybe, after all these years," he let the sentence trail off hopefully. "After all these years." The words made something cold slide through my stomach. I looked around my dining room as if I were seeing it for the first time. The table settings I had arranged that morning suddenly felt unfamiliar. My grandmother's-style candles, the polished silverware, the magnolia centerpiece from my flower shop resting in the center of the table. Everything still looked exactly the same, but the room no longer belonged to me. Judith stood carefully, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her sweater. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," she said gently. That almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because people like Judith always learned how to sound soft when they needed forgiveness from others. I stared at Daniel. "What is she doing here?" His expression shifted immediately from excitement to concern. "I talked to her a few months ago," he admitted cautiously. "I know you never wanted to reopen any of this, but Eleanor, you've carried this pain for so long." Pain. That was the word people like Daniel used when they had grown up loved. Pain sounded temporary, manageable, like something that healed cleanly if you talked about it enough. He had no idea what survival looked like inside a child. I swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how loud my heartbeat sounded inside my head. Daniel stepped closer. I thought maybe having one honest conversation could help everyone move forward. Everyone. As though this was some shared misunderstanding instead of 20 years of carefully built distance. I glanced toward the hallway and noticed something that made my stomach drop even harder. An unfamiliar suitcase stood near the staircase. Not a purse, not an overnight bag. A suitcase. "You invited her to stay here?" I asked quietly. Daniel hesitated for half a second too long. "Just through the holiday weekend." The room tilted slightly. I had spent 11 years building this house into the safest place I knew. Every detail inside it had been intentional. The soft lamps, the quiet colors, the routines. The locked doors checked twice every night before bed. People who grew up safe never understood how carefully some of us constructed peace. Judith looked around awkwardly. Daniel thought it might be good for us. I finally looked directly at her for the first time. Us. The word burned. Judith Mercer had spent most of my childhood treating me like an unwanted expense after my mother died. Nothing I did had ever been enough. Not quiet enough. Not grateful enough. Not useful enough. And now she was standing in my dining room, holding my linen napkin like she belonged there. Daniel reached for my hand, but I stepped back before he could touch me. The hurt that flashed across his face almost broke me, because I loved my husband. That was the terrible part. Daniel Hayes was not cruel, he wasn't controlling or selfish or malicious. He was kind in all the ordinary ways that matter inside a marriage. He remembered how I took my coffee. He kissed my forehead every morning before work. He bought fresh batteries before hurricane season because he knew storms made me anxious. But kindness without understanding could still wound people deeply. "Can we just sit down?" he asked softly. "Please." Judith lowered herself carefully back into her chair, suddenly looking fragile and old beneath the candlelight. I realized then that Daniel saw an elderly woman seeking reconciliation. I saw the person who taught me what it felt like to be unwanted inside my own home, and standing there in the warm glow of our Thanksgiving dining room, I understood something terrifying. The safest place I had ever built for myself no longer felt safe at all. I don't remember grabbing my coat. Second, I was standing in the hallway staring at Daniel like he had become a stranger inside his own face, and the next I was driving through downtown Savannah with tears blurring the streetlights into streaks of gold. Rain tapped softly against the windshield, not enough for a storm, just enough to make the roads shine. Daniel called 3 times before I finally silenced my phone completely. I couldn't hear his voice yet, not without breaking apart. The city was full of warm windows and glowing porches, families gathering, couples carrying pies into brightly lit homes. Everywhere I looked, people seemed to belong somewhere. I drove for almost 40 minutes before I finally pulled behind Magnolia and Vine. My flower shop sat quiet on the corner, its front windows dark except for the soft glow of the refrigerator cases inside. I unlocked the back entrance with shaking hands and stepped into the familiar scent of eucalyptus and roses. Only then did my breathing begin to slow. Flowers had always made more sense to me than people. Damaged flowers could still bloom if you handled them gently enough. People usually cut deeper where you were already broken. I sat on the small office couch in the back room and stared at nothing for a long time. Eventually, my mind drifted backward, the way trauma always does when someone tears open the wrong door. Judith Mercer was never my mother. My mother died when I was 9 years old after 3 years of hospitals, medications, and whispered adult conversations that always stopped when I walked into rooms. My father disappeared emotionally long before she actually died. After the funeral, he disappeared physically too. Judith was my mother's older sister-in-law. She and her husband took me in because nobody else wanted to. At least, that was the phrase she repeated often enough for me to memorize it. "You should be grateful we gave up our privacy for you. You should be grateful you weren't sent somewhere worse. You should be grateful anybody took you at all." Children believe the stories adults repeat around them long enough. By 13, I genuinely thought existing too loudly was selfish. Judith never hit me hard enough to leave bruises people would ask questions about. That wasn't her style. She specialized in smaller wounds. Locked pantry cabinets, cold silence that lasted days over tiny mistakes, humiliation disguised as discipline. If guests came over, she transformed into generosity itself, smiling, warm, patient. She'd rest her hand lightly against my shoulder and say things like, "Eleanor's still adjusting after everything she's been through." Then later, after everyone left, she'd hiss, "You embarrassed me tonight." I remember standing outside once during winter because I forgot to fold towels correctly. I remember trying not to cry because crying annoyed her more than mistakes did. Mostly, I remember hunger, not always for food, for softness, for safety, for one adult who looked at me without resentment. A sharp ache tightened unexpectedly in my chest. I reached automatically for the necklace beneath my sweater. The tiny gold locket Daniel had given me after my miscarriage 6 years earlier. Even now, the memory still hurt quietly. We had been married 5 years then. We'd already painted the spare bedroom pale yellow. Daniel had assembled the crib himself Sunday afternoon, while old jazz records played through the house. Then everything disappeared in a single hospital room. Afterward, Daniel grived outwardly. He cried. He wanted closeness. I came quieter, safer inside routines. I organized kitchen cabinets at midnight because control felt easier than heartbreak. Daniel used to tell me gently, "You don't always have to prepare for disaster," but disaster had raised me. Of course, I prepared for it. My phone buzzed again across the desk. Daniel. I almost ignored it. Instead, I opened the message. "Please come home. I never meant to hurt you." Another one appeared seconds later. "She just wants a chance to explain things." I laughed softly then, a broken little sound in the empty shop. Explain. People loved that word when they hadn't survived the thing being explained. I stood and wandered through the dark workroom, trailing my fingers along buckets of white hydrangeas, waiting for tomorrow's deliveries. That was when another message appeared. I booked her room upstairs because I thought having time together would help. I thought maybe if you really talked, you could finally heal. I stopped walking, room upstairs, not dinner, not one conversation, a plan. 6 months of phone calls and emotional planning behind my back. Suddenly, dozens of tiny moments from the past year rearranged themselves inside my head. Daniel casually asking whether I'd ever thought about reconnecting with surviving relatives. Him mentioning forgiveness after church one Sunday. The strange way he'd looked at me when I said some relationships should stay buried. Oh my God. He'd been building this for months. I sat back down slowly, staring at my phone while nausea twisted through me. The worst part wasn't Judith, not completely. It was realizing my husband had spent half a year studying my pain like a puzzle he believed he could solve if he loved me hard enough. Daniel came from one of those families that hugged constantly and argued loudly and recovered quickly. His parents had been married 47 years. His sisters called each other every morning before work. To Daniel, family meant safety by default. He had never understood that for some of us, family was the first danger we ever survived. Another voicemail notification appeared. I hesitated before pressing play. His voice sounded tired now, smaller somehow. "She's staying through the holiday weekend," he said softly. "I know you're angry, but Eleanor, I really thought this could finally help you move on." The message ended. I stared out at the dark flower shop for a long time after that. Then I whispered the thought that frightened me most. For the first time since I married Daniel Hayes, I wasn't sure he understood me at all. I barely slept. By sunrise, my neck ached from the office couch and my eyes burned from exhaustion, but the panic inside me had settled into something colder and steadier. Anger. Outside the flower shop window, Savannah moved through Thanksgiving morning as though nothing in the world had broken overnight. Couples carried bakery boxes down the sidewalks. Church bells rang faintly in the distance. A little girl in a red coat laughed while chasing pigeons across the square. Normal life continued so easily for people who had never learned how quickly safety could disappear. I made coffee in the tiny backroom machine and stared at my phone while it brewed. 8 missed calls from Daniel, 3 voicemails, several messages that grew progressively more worried as the night passed. "Please answer. I'm sorry. Please don't stay there alone. I know you're hurt, but we can work through this." That last message almost made me throw the phone across the room. Work through this. As though he'd accidentally forgotten to pick up milk instead of inviting my childhood trauma into our guest bedroom. Still, by mid-morning, another feeling had begun creeping beneath the anger. Violation. Judith was still inside my house, using my towels, sitting in my kitchen, existing inside rooms I had spent years turning into safe places, and somehow that thought became unbearable. So I drove home. The streets were crowded with Thanksgiving traffic by then. Every red light gave me another opportunity to turn around, but I didn't. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my stomach was tight enough to hurt. Daniel opened the front door before I even reached it. Relief flooded his face so visibly that guilt stabbed unexpectedly through me. Thank God, he breathed. I was worried. I stepped past him without answering. The house smelled like sage stuffing and roasted turkey. Soft instrumental music drifted from the living room speaker. Everything looked warm and beautiful and violently wrong. Then I saw it. A second coffee mug beside Daniel's in the sink. A folded gray cardigan draped neatly across one of my dining chairs. Judith's suitcase still standing near the staircase. Tiny things. Ordinary things. But trauma lives in details. Daniel followed me carefully through the kitchen. I know this is uncomfortable. Uncomfortable? I turned toward him so fast he stopped speaking. His expression shifted immediately. Not defensive, confused. That somehow hurt worse. I shouldn't have surprised you, he said carefully. I understand that now. No, I said quietly, you don't. Silence stretched between us. Then another voice floated gently from the dining room. Eleanor? My entire body tightened instantly. Judith stepped into the kitchen, holding one of my ceramic teacups like she belonged there. Her silver hair was neatly brushed now. She looked soft in the daylight, fragile even. People trusted fragile-looking women. That was part of how people like Judith survived accountability. I'm glad you came back, she said. I know this is emotional. Emotional. Another harmless word people used when they wanted to shrink something ugly into something manageable. I crossed my arms tightly. Why are you here? Her expression flickered almost imperceptibly. I wanted to make peace before it's too late. There it was. Not remorse. Urgency. Aging people often became desperate to rewrite history before death arrived. Daniel stepped between us slightly, trying to soften the tension already thickening the room. Maybe we should just take things slowly today, he suggested. Nobody has to force anything. But he still didn't understand. Simply bringing her here had already forced everything. Judith set the teacup down carefully. I know I wasn't perfect raising you, raises me. The phrase made my skin crawl. She said it the same way people described fostering abandoned puppies. I was grieving too after your mother died, she continued softly. We all did the best we could. I stared at her, and suddenly I could smell cigarette smoke from 28 years ago. Could hear cabinet doors slamming. Could feel freezing porch wood beneath my bare feet. People who grow up in healthy homes never understand this part of trauma. Memory isn't always visual. Sometimes your body remembers first. Daniel rubbed a hand nervously across the back of his neck. Maybe today can just be a fresh start. I looked at him slowly. Fresh start. He truly believed this was repairable through enough kindness and conversation. He still thought this was conflict, not damage. The doorbell rang before I could answer. Daniel's face brightened with relief. That'll be Michael and Renee. I blinked at him. You invited people? His expression faltered slightly. Just dinner guests. I thought having a normal Thanksgiving atmosphere might help everybody relax. I actually laughed then. A short, stunned sound. My trauma had become a social event. Michael and Renee Talbot entered carrying sweet potato casserole and wine, all cheerful warmth and church hugs. Renee immediately complimented the flower arrangement near the entryway. Judith smiled at them with practiced gentleness. Within minutes, she looked perfectly believable, as a misunderstood, older relative reconnecting with family. That was the danger of emotional abuse. It rarely left visible scars people could identify quickly. Dinner preparations continued around me while I floated somewhere outside myself. Michael discussed football scores with Daniel in the living room. Renee helped set the table while chatting pleasantly with Judith about Savannah weather and holiday traditions. And Judith adapted beautifully. Soft voice, patient smile, measured sadness. The performance would have impressed me if it hadn't once controlled my entire childhood. At one point, Renee touched my arm gently while arranging silverware. Family disagreements get heavier the longer we carry them, she said kindly. I forced a tight smile. Across the room, Daniel looked hopeful hearing that. Hopeful. As though everyone around him was confirming he'd done the right thing. Later that evening, while carrying dishes toward the kitchen, I stopped when I heard Daniel speaking quietly to Judith near the sink. I really thought, once she saw you weren't angry anymore, he said softly, things could finally heal. Judith sighed dramatically. She's always held on to things too tightly. Something inside me went completely still, not because of Judith, because Daniel wasn't correcting her. He was listening. I backed away before they noticed me and walked upstairs mechanically. Inside our bedroom, I sat at the edge of the bed trying to breathe normally. Then I noticed fresh towels, folded neatly inside the guest room doorway across the hall. Prepared days ago, planned carefully, permanent enough for folded towels. And suddenly I was 13 again, listening outside closed doors while adults discussed my future without ever asking what I wanted. A soft knock startled me. Daniel stepped into the bedroom cautiously. "Can you at least try to meet her halfway?" he asked quietly. I stared at him in disbelief. And in that moment, I understood something devastating. My husband still thought this was a disagreement between two wounded adults. He had no idea he was asking a child to sit politely at the table with the person who taught her what fear felt like inside a home. By the time we sat down for Thanksgiving dinner, I felt like I was watching someone else's life from very far away. Candles flickered softly down the center of the table. The turkey sat perfectly golden beneath the dining room lights. Crystal glasses reflected warm amber light against the walls, while old jazz hummed quietly through the speakers. Everything looked beautiful. That was the cruel thing about emotionally dangerous moments. Sometimes they happened in perfectly decorated rooms. Michael Talbot carved turkey while Renee complimented the stuffing. Daniel poured wine too quickly because his hands were nervous. Judith sat directly across from me, wearing a careful expression of fragile gratitude, and I sat there trying not to disappear inside myself. "Eleanor's flower arrangements always make holidays feel elegant," Renee said warmly. "She's always had a gift for making things beautiful," Judith added gently. My stomach twisted. People like Judith loved complimenting the versions of you they helped break. Daniel smiled at me carefully from beside the mashed potatoes. It wasn't a normal smile. It was hopeful, fragile, like he kept waiting for the evening to transform into the healing moment he'd imagined. I couldn't stop thinking about the folded towels in the guest room upstairs. Proof. He hadn't invited Judith into our home impulsively. He had prepared space for her. Michael lifted his wineglass. "To family," he announced cheerfully. The word landed heavily in my chest. Everyone raised their glasses except me. Judith noticed. Her expression softened with practiced sadness. "I know this must be difficult for you." Difficult. Another small harmless word. I stared at my untouched wine. At some point during childhood, survivors learn that language can be its own kind of manipulation. People soften ugly things until the truth becomes socially uncomfortable to say out loud. Judith didn't say abuse, she said difficult. Daniel cleared his throat gently. "Maybe tonight can just be about honesty." I looked at him slowly. Honesty, the irony almost hurt. Dinner continued awkwardly after that. Renee asked polite questions about the flower shop. Michael discussed church renovations with Daniel. Judith kept contributing small memories from my childhood in that same soft, sorrowful voice. "You used to love helping me bake at Christmas," she said at one point. A flash exploded behind my eyes so suddenly I nearly stopped breathing. I was 11 years old again, standing on a chair beside the kitchen counter while Judith slapped flour from my hands because I cracked eggs too slowly. "You ruin everything you touch," she had snapped. Back then, I apologized constantly for existing incorrectly. Now I just sat frozen at my own dining room table while she rewrote history in front of witnesses. "She was always sensitive," Judith continued quietly. "Losing her mother so young affected everything," Renee said sympathetically. Daniel looked conflicted, but still hopeful, and suddenly I understood something horrifying. Everyone at this table was hearing her version first, not mine. Judith reached delicately for her wineglass. "I know I made mistakes," she sighed, "but I did the best I could raising a grieving child." That sentence finally broke something open inside me, because she still called it raising me, as though emotional starvation counted as care. I set my fork down carefully. The sound against the plate cut sharply through the room. Conversation stopped. For a moment nobody moved. Then I heard my own voice. Quiet. Steady. You locked pantry cabinets because you thought I ate too much. The room went completely silent. Judith blinked once. I kept going. You made me apologize for using electricity if I stayed awake too late reading. My throat tightened. I forced the words out anyway. You told me nobody would ever really want me because grieving children exhausted people. Daniel stared at me like he'd never heard my voice before. Judith shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor, no, I interrupted softly. You don't get to soften this now. Michael slowly lowered his fork. Renee looked stunned, and somewhere beside me, Daniel stopped breathing normally. I turned toward Judith fully for the first time all evening. Do you remember locking me outside because I folded towels wrong? Her face tightened instantly. You were dramatic as a child, she said quietly. Dramatic. I almost laughed again. That word had followed me my entire life any time my pain became inconvenient for someone else. You counted food, I continued. You made me feel guilty for every meal I ate after my mother died. Judith's eyes flashed defensively now. Your uncle and I sacrificed a lot for you. There it is, I whispered. The truth, not love, not grief. Sacrifice, as though I had been debt instead of family. Daniel finally spoke, his voice unsteady. Eleanor, why didn't you ever tell me it was this bad? I looked at him then, really looked at him, at the confusion in his face, at the horror slowly replacing hope. And suddenly I understood something equally painful. He truly had never known, because people raised inside love never imagine homes can become survival zones for children. Because survivors don't tell stories the way comfortable people want them told, I said quietly. We tell them in fragments, in panic attacks, in over-prepared kitchens and locked doors and backup cash hidden in drawers. The room stayed silent. Even Judith said nothing. I swallowed hard. You thought forgiveness was love because nobody ever taught you what fear inside a home feels like. Daniel looked physically wounded hearing that. But I wasn't finished. I turned toward him fully. You didn't betray me because you invited her, I said softly. You betrayed me because you decided my pain needed your permission to heal. Daniel's face collapsed completely then. Not defensive anymore, not hopeful, just devastated. Judith suddenly straightened in her chair. I will not sit here and be painted like some monster after everything I did for you. And there it was again. Not one apology, not one moment of concern for what happened to me. Only defense, only image, only herself. Renee quietly whispered, I didn't know. Neither did I, not fully. Not until I finally heard the truth out loud inside a room full of people. I stood slowly from the table. Daniel immediately rose after me. Eleanor, wait, but I was already walking toward the hallway. My chest hurt so badly it felt impossible to breathe. Daniel caught up with me near the front door. Please, he whispered desperately. I'm sorry, I didn't understand. I stared at him while tears burned behind my eyes. No, I said quietly. You managed me. You protected her comfort more than my safety. The words hit him like physical force. I grabbed my coat from the hallway chair. Then I left my own Thanksgiving dinner while candlelight still glowed warmly behind me, like nothing inside that house had shattered. I drove back to the flower shop with tears blurring the streetlights so badly I almost missed two red lights downtown. By the time I unlocked the back door, my entire body felt hollowed out, not relieved, not angry anymore, just exhausted in a way that settled deep into my bones. I left the lights off and sat alone in the workroom surrounded by unfinished holiday arrangements. White roses rested in metal buckets beside eucalyptus stems waiting to be trimmed in the morning. The shop smelled clean and alive. Unlike my chest, my wedding ring felt unbearably heavy on my hand. I stared at it for a long time before slowly sliding it off and placing it beside a vase of dying white roses on the work table. The sight of it there nearly broke me, because I still loved Daniel. That was the problem. If he had been cruel, leaving would have been sensible. Cruel men are easier to survive than kind men who accidentally reopen your deepest wounds. My phone buzzed again across the table. Daniel. This time I answered. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then I heard him exhale shakily. "She's gone," he said quietly. I closed my eyes. "What?" I asked Judith to leave. Silence filled the room between us, not triumphant silence. Not satisfying silence, just grief. "I should done it before you ever had to ask," he whispered. Something in his voice sounded different now. Not defensive, not hopeful. Broken. I leaned back against the counter behind me. Why? Another long pause. Because she never once sounded sorry, he admitted quietly. Even after tonight, I didn't answer. Daniel continued carefully, like each word hurt him. She kept talking about how difficult you were as a child, about sacrifice, about misunderstandings. His voice cracked slightly. She never asked whether you were okay. I stared at the wedding ring beside the roses. Finally, Daniel was beginning to see it. The problem had never been conflict. The problem was that Judith still viewed herself as the victim of my existence. "I found some things in the closet after you left," he said softly. My stomach tightened immediately. "What things? A box?" "Oh no." I closed my eyes. Inside that box were pieces of a life I almost never touched anymore. Old school records, foster evaluations, medical paperwork, counselor notes, proof. Children who grow up emotionally unsafe become archivists of their own suffering, because eventually someone always not says, "It couldn't have been that bad." Daniel's breathing sounded uneven now. "There was a journal," he whispered. "You were 13. I remembered the little blue notebook instantly. I hadn't opened it in years. "I didn't mean to invade your privacy," he continued. After tonight, I needed to understand what I missed." Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes, not because he read it, because he finally realized there was something he had missed at all. "I wrote one line over and over," he said quietly. "If I stay quiet enough, maybe people won't get tired of me." My chest tightened painfully. I had forgotten writing that. Or maybe I had simply buried it deeply enough to survive adulthood. Daniel sounded like he was crying now. And somehow, hearing that hurt worse than hearing him defend himself ever could. "I didn't know," he whispered again. "I know. That was the tragedy of it. He truly hadn't known." Daniel Hayes came from one of those families where people argued loudly and recovered quickly because love underneath the conflict was never questioned. His mother hugged everyone constantly. His father cried openly at weddings. His sisters called him every Sunday without fail. To Daniel, family meant safety by default. To me, safety had always been conditional. "I thought I was helping you heal," he said quietly. I looked around the dark flower shop. Rows of fragile things depending entirely on gentle handling. "You thought healing meant reopening the wound," I whispered. Silence, then softly, "What does healing mean to you?" The question caught me off guard. Not because it was profound, because it was the first time he had asked instead of deciding. I swallowed hard. "Safety." The word sat heavily between us. "Not forgiveness?" No, another silence followed. Then I heard him inhale shakily again. "I spent years thinking your boundaries were walls," he admitted. "I thought if I loved you enough, eventually you wouldn't need them anymore." Tears slipped quietly down my face, because that was exactly what he had believed. And because part of me understood why. People raised inside healthy love often confuse openness with healing. They don't realize boundaries are sometimes the only thing standing between survivors and collapse. "You saw distance," I said softly. I saw instructions for staying alive. His breathing caught again. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Daniel said quietly, "I want to learn how to love you without hurting you." God, that almost destroyed me completely. Because he meant it, and because love alone still hadn't protected me. The next morning I opened the shop early, despite barely sleeping. My eyes felt swollen and my body ached with emotional exhaustion. Tessa arrived 20 minutes later carrying coffee and immediately stopped when she saw my face. "Oh no," she said gently. Holiday family disaster? I let out a tired laugh before I could stop myself. You could say that. Tessa sat beside me on the work table while we processed inventory orders. After a few minutes, she said quietly, I stopped spending holidays with my mother 3 years ago. I glanced at her in surprise. She only knows how to love people she can control. Tessa added with a shrug. Some families confuse access with entitlement. The word settled heavily inside me. Survivors always recognized each other eventually, not through details, through language. Around noon, the front bell above the shop door chimed softly. Daniel stood there looking exhausted. His eyes immediately found the wedding ring beside the vase of white roses. And I watched the realization physically hit him. He didn't ask me to put it back on, didn't tell me to come home, didn't pressure me at all. For the first time since Thanksgiving began, he simply respected the distance I needed. I called a therapist this morning, he said quietly. I blinked. For me too, he added quickly. Not just for you. Something inside my chest shifted slightly. Not forgiveness, not yet. But maybe the smallest beginning of understanding. Daniel stepped closer slowly. You were right, he said softly. I didn't betray you because I wanted to hurt you. I betrayed you because I decided your pain needed my permission to heal. Tears burned behind my eyes again. Because finally, he understood the difference. And somehow that hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself. Spring arrived quietly that year, not dramatically. Not with some cinematic sunrise where suddenly everything inside me felt healed and whole again. Healing, I learned, was much less beautiful than people imagined. It looked like awkward therapy appointments on Tuesday afternoons. It looked like sitting in silence beside my husband without knowing whether to reach for his hand. It looked like crying unexpectedly in grocery store parking lots because someone raised their voice 2 aisles over. Mostly, healing looked boring, which after a lifetime of emotional chaos started to feel miraculous. By March, Daniel and I had settled into something fragile but honest. We were still together. But our marriage no longer rested on assumptions. That was the difference. Before Thanksgiving, Daniel had loved me through the lens of his own understanding. He thought love naturally erased fear if you gave it enough patience and warmth. After Thanksgiving, he finally understood that fear doesn't disappear simply because someone kind enters the room. Sometimes fear survives long after danger ends. Therapy forced both of us to say uncomfortable things out loud. I hated it at first. The therapist asked questions nobody had ever asked me before. What made you feel emotionally safest as a child? Nothing. When did you first learn love could disappear? Always. What do you need from your husband now? That question almost broke me completely, because I still didn't fully know. For most of my life, survival had mattered more than need. Daniel attended his own sessions too. And slowly, painfully slowly, I began noticing changes. Not grand gestures, small things. He stopped inviting people over without asking first. He stopped saying things like, "You're overreacting." Instead, he started asking, "Do you feel safe right now?" That question alone changed something inside me. One evening in April, I came home from the flower shop to find Daniel standing in the kitchen holding one of my old emergency cash envelopes. I froze instantly. For years I had hidden small amounts of money all over the house. Kitchen drawer, bathroom cabinet, winter coat pocket, insurance, survival money. Daniel looked at the envelope carefully before setting it back down untouched. I'm not upset, he said softly. I just finally understand why you did it. Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes. Because he wasn't mocking me, wasn't trying to logic me out of it, wasn't treating my fear like irrational inconvenience. He was simply trying to understand it. That was new. And maybe understanding mattered more than fixing ever had. A few weeks later, I received a letter from Judith. I recognized her handwriting immediately and almost threw it away unopened. Instead, I sat alone in the flower shop office after closing and forced myself to read it. The apology inside was careful and polished. She admitted she could have handled things differently. She said grief had made her harder than intended. She wrote, "I hope one day you can remember the good parts too." Not once did she actually name what happened. Not once did she say abuse. By the end of the letter, I realized something surprising. I no longer needed her to understand. For years, I thought healing required acknowledgement from the people who hurt me. But therapy taught me something different. Validation does not have to come from the source of the wound. Sometimes survivors spend decades waiting for apologies that were never emotionally possible from the people who caused the damage. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope. Then I threw it away. Not angrily, just finally finished with it. That night, Daniel found me sitting on the back porch watching rain collect along the railing. "Did you read it?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "How do you feel?" I thought about the question honestly before answering. "Free," I admitted softly. He sat beside me without speaking for a while. Then he said something I don't think I'll ever forget. "I used to think forgiveness meant reopening the relationship," he said quietly. "Now I think maybe forgiveness just means the pain stops controlling your life." I looked at him carefully. "You really have changed." His smile looked sad around the edges. "I had to," he admitted. "I loved you without understanding you for too long." That sentence stayed with me for weeks afterward, because it was true. Love without understanding can still wound people deeply, but understanding without defensiveness, that could begin repairing things. By the time Thanksgiving returned the following year, our house felt different. Quieter somehow, safer, not because the past disappeared, because we stopped pretending safety and forgiveness were the same thing. This time, there was no giant dinner table filled with emotional performance, no forced reconciliation, no carefully managed peace. Just people we trusted. Tessa came over carrying homemade pie and terrible grocery store wine she insisted tasted expensive. Two foster teenagers from a local holiday volunteer program joined us after helping deliver floral arrangements through the community center. One of them, a skinny 16-year-old named Ava, barely spoke all evening, but I noticed her slipping extra dinner rolls into napkins when she thought nobody was watching. Something inside my chest tightened painfully at the sight. Survival behavior. I recognized it instantly. Without embarrassing her, I quietly packed leftovers in containers for both teens before they left. Ava looked startled when I handed her the bag. "You don't have to do that," she murmured automatically. That sentence hurt me more than she probably realized. Children who grow up emotionally unsafe always believe care comes with conditions. "Yes," I said gently, "I do." Across the kitchen, I noticed Daniel watching us silently. And for the first time, I knew he truly understood what trauma looked like in ordinary moments. Not dramatic breakdowns, not screaming, just small, fearful habits people carried quietly through everyday life. Later that night, after everyone left, Daniel and I sat alone at the dining room table while candles burned low between us. 1 year earlier, this room had become the place where everything inside our marriage cracked open. Now it felt peaceful, not perfect, but honest. Daniel leaned back in his chair and studied me carefully. "Do you think your family will ever heal?" he asked softly. I looked around the room before answering, at the half-finished pie, at the empty coffee mugs, at the warmth still lingering quietly inside the house. Then I thought about Ava hiding dinner rolls in napkins, about Tessa laughing too loudly whenever conversations became emotional, about Daniel learning how to ask permission before trying to save me. And suddenly the answer felt obvious. "This is my family now," I said quietly. "The people who learned how to love me without making me afraid first." Daniel's eyes filled immediately, not because the answer was sad, because it wasn't. For the first time in my life, home no longer felt like something I had to earn through silence or usefulness or gratitude. It simply felt safe. Later that night, after Daniel went upstairs, I stayed behind long enough to blow out the final candle at the center of the table. The room fell softly into darkness. And standing there alone in the quiet house we had nearly destroyed trying to heal incorrectly, I realized something important. Healing was never about reopening old doors. It was about finally learning which ones deserved to stay locked. And honestly, I think a lot of people struggle with that. Some people believe love means giving endless access to anyone connected to you by blood or history, but sometimes real love looks as more like boundaries. Sometimes healing means choosing peace over reconciliation. So I'd genuinely love to know what you think. Do you believe family always deserves another chance? Or are there some wounds people lose the right to return from? If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below and share your thoughts. And if you enjoy emotional stories about family, trust, healing, and second chances, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.